Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slow, rhythmic walk up the garden path to look at something you've probably interacted with 10,000 times without ever actually seeing it. We're talking about the doorbell, that humble plastic or brass button that stands as the thin electrical line between the safety of your couch and the terrifying reality of a stranger holding a clipboard. You're standing on a porch, and the air is still, and for a split second, your finger hovers over that little illuminated circle, and you realize that this tiny device is basically the play button for the social theater of your life. Personally, I've always found it a bit absurd how much power we give to a 16-volt circuit. It's the only thing in the world that can make a grown man dive behind a sofa to pretend he isn't home just because he wasn't expecting a delivery. You probably won't survive the sheer overwhelming boredom of tracing the electrical impedance of a 1920s chime. But that's why we're here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're already halfway to dreamland, maybe just drop a comment with your location and the local time so I know where in the world we're currently haunting. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge back in time, away from the sleek digital cameras and the silent haptic feedback of your smartphone, to a world where the front door was a silent, unyielding barrier of oak and iron. You're standing in the late 18th century, and your knuckles are already starting to throb just thinking about the heavy knock. Personally, I find it incredibly frustrating that for most of human history, our primary method of announcing ourselves was basically a low-level physical assault on a piece of wood. It's a mainstream historical fact that before the mid-1800s, the door knocker was the peak of home security and communication technology. A literal hunk of metal you used to scream, "I am here," through sheer kinetic energy. You reach out and grab a heavy cast-iron ring shaped like a lion's head. It's cold, it's damp, and it carries the weight of 1,000 impatient visitors. When you let it fall, the sound isn't a melody. It's a bone-shaking thud that echoes through the hallway like a gavel in a courtroom. I've always felt that the door knocker was a bit too aggressive for a polite society. It's the original all-caps text message. If you're the person inside, that sound doesn't say, "Someone is here for tea." It says, "The Vikings have arrived and they'd like to discuss your taxes." A quirky tidbit of this era is that some high society homes actually had mufflers for their knockers, small pieces of leather or cloth wrapped around the iron, to ensure that the sound didn't disturb the household during times of illness or mourning. Personally, I suspect those mufflers were actually just a way for the wealthy to ignore the poor with a bit more grace. Imagine being a messenger in a London fog, banging a leather-wrapped lion against a door and hoping someone, somewhere, hears the muffled thumping over the sound of the rain. It's a scholarly debate whether the decline of the door knocker contributed to a general decrease in upper body strength among the servant class. But for you, standing on this silent porch, it just feels like a lot of work for a very small reward. You look at the door knocker and realize it's a deeply honest device. It doesn't rely on batteries, it doesn't need a transformer, and it can't be hacked by a teenager in a different time zone. It's just physics and frustration. But as you stand there, you start to notice the silent porch syndrome. If the house is too big, or if the walls are too thick, your knock is basically a tree falling in a forest with no one around to hear it. I find it relatable that even in the 1700s, people were already experiencing the bad connection vibe. You're banging on the door, and the person in the kitchen is 3 hallways away, blissfully unaware that you're standing in a puddle. Personally, I'd be losing my mind, probably looking for a rock or a very loud stick. But the world was waiting for a more elegant solution. This is where the boring USA starts to get interesting, or at least as interesting as a piece of hardware can get. You see the transition from the knocker to the pull bell, which was the first attempt to move the sound from the outside of the door to the inside of the house. It's a clunky mechanical ancestor that feels more like a trapdoor mechanism than a greeting. You see a brass handle tucked into the door frame, attached to a stiff wire that disappears into a hole in the masonry. When you pull it, you aren't completing a circuit. You're engaging in a tug-of-war with a series of pulleys and cranks hidden behind the wallpaper. I've always thought that the pull bell was the manual transmission of the doorbell world. It required a specific kind of wrist flick, a certain level of confidence that said, "I am important enough to warrant this mechanical effort." If you pull too hard, you snap the wire and spend the next 3 hours explaining to a grumpy homeowner why their communication system is now a pile of metal spaghetti. If you pull too light, the bell in the kitchen just gives a pathetic, limp wiggle. Personally, I suspect that half the social tension of the Victorian era was just people being annoyed that their bell pulls were out of alignment. You trudge inside the house, following the path of that wire as it snakes through the ceiling joists. It's a sensory nightmare of creaking wood and scratching metal. The air smells of beeswax and coal soot, and the only light comes from the flickering gas lamps that cast long, spindly shadows of the bell cranks against the plaster. I find it fascinating how we take our instant world for granted. Back then, instant meant waiting for a physical wire to travel 40 feet through a house to shake a brass cup. It was a rhythmic, mechanical dance that connected the Skywalker elite in the drawing room to the ground dwellers in the basement. You realize that the doorbell, even in its most primitive form, was always about hierarchy. It was about who had the right to ring and who had the duty to answer. Personally, I'd probably be the one in the basement, ignoring the bell and pretending I was fascinated by the texture of a potato. But for the rest of the world, this was the cutting edge of domestic life. As you settle into the rhythm of the Victorian house, you start to hear the ghost bells, that faint, phantom jingling that happens when the wind catches the wire, or a house guest leans too hard against the door frame. It's a lonely, haunting sound that reminds you how far we are from the digital pips of the modern world. You look at your hands, and they're covered in the gray dust of the 19th century. You're part of the gang now, the ones who understand that a doorbell isn't just a gadget, it's a declaration of existence. You close your eyes for a second, the image of the lion's head knocker and the brass pull handle lulling you into a strange, mechanical peace. It's a long way to the smart cam, but the journey is just beginning. You take a final breath of the dusty, beeswax-scented air, feeling the vibration of the old house in your bones, and you wait. The wire is taut, the bell is ready, and the boring USA is finally finding its voice in the dark. You leave the aggressive thud of the lion's head knocker behind and step further into the guts of the 19th century home, where the pull bells and the physics of friction begin to dominate your sensory world. Personally, I've always found mechanical linkages to be deeply stressful. There is something about a hidden wire under tension that feels like a trap waiting to spring. You're standing in a narrow hallway, and your eyes follow a stiff iron wire that runs along the crown molding, held up by tiny brass loops that look like jewelry for a very industrial giant. This is the nervous system of the house before electricity decided to show up and make everything easy. It's a mainstream historical fact that by the mid-1800s, the mechanical bell system was the standard for any American home with more than 2 rooms and a sense of self-importance. It moved the act of signaling from a blunt force trauma on the front door to a delicate, yet surprisingly strenuous, tug of a handle. I've always felt that the bell pull was a bit of a workout, disguised as etiquette. You aren't just pushing a button, you're fighting gravity and the accumulated grime of every year since the house was built. When you pull that exterior handle, you're dragging a wire through a series of bell cranks, L-shaped pieces of metal that turn the motion 90 degrees around corners. I find it relatable that these systems were basically the buffering icon of the 1850s. You pull the handle, and then you wait. You wait for the kinetic energy to travel through the attic, down the servants' stairs, and finally into the kitchen. A quirky tidbit of this mechanical era is that bell hangers were among the most highly paid tradesmen of the time because a single degree of misalignment in a crank could silence a house forever. Personally, I suspect these bell hangers were the original, overpriced consultants, walking around with a bottle of oil and a smug expression while charging a month's wages to fix a ghost jingle. You trudge into the servants' quarters, a place where the air smells of boiled cabbage and damp wool, and you look up at the bell board. It's a row of brass bells of slightly different sizes, each mounted on a spiral spring that looks like it belongs in the suspension of a very small carriage. When a guest pulls the handle out front, the bell doesn't just ring once, it dances. It wiggles and shimmies on that spring for a good 30 seconds, a visual notification that lingers long after the sound has faded. I find it fascinating how this was the original, persistent notification on your lock screen. Historians still argue whether the specific pitch of these bells was intentionally designed to be irritating to ensure a quick response, or if the discordant cacophony was just a byproduct of cheap brass casting. Personally, I suspect it was the former. There's nothing like a high-pitched, vibrating jingle to make you want to drop whatever you're doing, just to make it stop. I've always thought the physics of friction in these houses was a cruel mistress. In the summer, the wires would expand and go limp, making the bells sluggish and pathetic. In the winter, the metal contracted, and suddenly the guest at the front door was accidentally ripping the handle out of the wall just to get a ding. It's a rhythmic, seasonal struggle that I find incredibly authentic. You realize that before we had smart homes, we had moody homes. The house breathed, it groaned, and its communication system was as temperamental as the people living in it. Personally, I'd be losing my mind trying to keep the tension just right, probably ending up with a series of strings tied to my toes just so I wouldn't miss a delivery of coal or a visit from a distant wealthy aunt. You watch a housemaid look at the bell board. She isn't just listening, she's pattern matching. Is it the front door bell? The drawing room bell? The master bedroom? Each one has a slightly different wiggle on its spring. It's a proto-user interface that relied on human observation rather than a digital readout. I find it relatable that even back then, we were already slaves to the ping. The bell board was the 19th century version of having your phone on the table during dinner. You're always one jingle away from your life being interrupted by someone else's needs. Personally, I find the mechanical honesty of it quite refreshing compared to the hidden cloud logic of today. If the bell rings, it's because a wire moved. There's no mystery, just a lot of brass and a little bit of sweat. As the gaslight flickers, casting long, wavering shadows of the bells against the soot-stained plaster, you realize that this system was the peak of boring USA engineering. It was reliable, it was loud, and it required zero batteries. But it was also a sensory nightmare for anyone who valued peace and quiet. The physics of friction meant that every time someone moved a handle, the whole house knew. You could hear the wires scraping through the walls, a metallic screeching sound that I imagine was the soundtrack to many a Victorian headache. I suspect that the move toward electricity wasn't just about efficiency. It was a desperate attempt to stop the house from sounding like a rusty clockwork toy every time someone wanted a glass of water. You settle into a chair in the kitchen, watching the bells slowly come to rest. The silence that follows is thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the next room. You're part of the ground dwellers now, the ones who wait for the world to call. You look at the tensioned wires and realize they are like the strings of a giant domestic harp, except the music is always a demand. Personally, I'd be tempted to cut the wires and enjoy a week of blessed, uninterrupted silence. But in this world, a silent house is a dead house. You take a final breath of the cabbage and wax-scented air, feeling the latent energy in the springs, and you wait. The next guest is coming. The wire is ready to scrape, and the boring USA is preparing for its next great leap into the spark. You close your eyes, the image of the vibrating brass cups lulling you into a state of mechanical readiness. The friction is constant, the physics are unyielding, and the chime is just a pull away. You leave the mechanical straining of the bell wires behind and move toward the flickering experimental glow of the 18th and early 19th centuries, where Benjamin Franklin's static electricity bells turned the front porch into a high-stakes physics lab. Personally, I've always found static electricity to be one of the more annoying forces of nature. It's the thing that ruins a good hair day or zaps you when you're just trying to do your laundry. But for the early pioneers of the boring USA, it was the literal spark of genius. You're standing in a wood-paneled study, the air smelling of ozone and expensive tobacco, watching a pair of small brass bells hanging from a lightning rod. It's a mainstream historical fact that Benjamin Franklin, between inventing bifocals and trying not to get executed by the British, rigged up a set of lightning bells in his home that would ring whenever a storm was brewing. It wasn't exactly a doorbell for guests, but rather a doorbell for the wrath of God. I've always felt that having a doorbell that only rings when a lethal bolt of electricity is nearby is a bit too mad scientist for a cozy Tuesday evening. You see the mechanism. A small clapper hangs between two bells, and as the static charge builds up, the clapper is pulled back and forth, creating a frantic, ghostly ting-ting-ting. I find it relatable that Franklin's wife, Deborah, reportedly hated these things. Imagine trying to sleep while your hallway is screaming that the atmosphere is currently a giant battery. A quirky tidbit of this electrical prehistory is that Franklin's bells weren't just for show. He used the charge to perform electrical kisses and other party tricks that probably wouldn't pass a modern safety inspection. Personally, I suspect Franklin just liked the drama. Nothing says, "I'm the smartest guy in Philadelphia," like a house that jingles every time a cloud passes by. You trudge over to a primitive Leyden jar, which is basically a glass bottle wrapped in foil that acts as the world's most dangerous AA battery. This was the precursor to the modern chime, but instead of a gentle melody, it offered a rhythmic, snapping spark. I find it fascinating that for decades, historians still argue whether Franklin actually intended for these devices to be domestic appliances or if they were purely for meteorological data. Personally, I think he just realized that information is a lot more useful when it has an audio notification attached. Standing in that room, watching a blue spark jump across a gap in the wires, you realize that the doorbell was born from the same energy as the lightning bolt. It's a heavy, intoxicating thought that makes your skin crawl. Or maybe that's just the static charge in the air. I've always thought that early electricity was a very roughneck science. There were no insulated wires, no safety breakers, And your gentle chime could technically set your curtains on fire if a storm got too rowdy. It's an authentic, gritty bit of history that I find deeply satisfying. You see the early experiments where they tried to use these static bells to alert a homeowner to a visitor at the gate. But the physics of friction we talked about earlier was replaced by the physics of humidity. If it rained too hard, the charge leaked away, and your visitor was left standing in the dark, banging on a lion's head knocker anyway. Personally, I'd be the one triple-checking the Leyden jars, terrified that my smart home was about to explode into a ball of blue fire just because the neighbor's cat rubbed against the fence. You watch the blue light reflect in the polished wood of the desk, and you realize that these spark-filled precursors were the first time we separated the act of signaling from the effort of signaling. You aren't pulling a wire, you're triggering a force. It's the original touch-free interface. I find it relatable that we are still obsessed with this, from the haptic feedback on your phone to the motion-sensing lights in your driveway. We still want to feel like wizards. But in Franklin's day, that wizardry came with the smell of burnt hair and a persistent fear of a direct hit from above. Personally, I find the modern ding-dong to be a bit of a letdown compared to a device that rings because the sky is angry. As the storm outside the window begins to rumble, the bells start their rhythmic, metallic dance. It's a haunting, high-pitched sound that fills the room, casting long, wavering shadows of the wire leads against the wallpaper. You're part of the static elite now, the ones who understand that communication is just controlled lightning. You look at your hands, and you can see the fine hairs standing on end. I suspect that the move from static to electromagnetism wasn't just about reliability. It was about the fact that most people don't want their doorbell to be a death trap. You realize that the boring USA was founded on these high-voltage risks, a bit of colonial ingenuity that I find deeply moving. You settle into a high-backed chair, watching the clapper vibrate with a frenetic electrical energy. The pre-modern chime is a reminder that we've always wanted to reach out and touch someone, even if it meant getting a 50,000-volt shock in the process. Personally, I find a lot of respect in that ambition. It's a long way to the low-voltage transformer in your basement, but the spark has been lit. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic tinging of the lightning bells lulling you into a state of electrical tension. The air is heavy, the charge is building, and the boring USA is finally preparing to tame the lightning into a buzzer. You take a final breath of the ozone-scented air, feeling the latent power in the glass jars, and you wait. The storm is coming, the bells are ringing, and the journey into the wire is just getting started. You move away from the crackling, erratic sparks of Franklin's lightning bells and step into the hum of the 1830s, a decade where the great buzz began to vibrate through the floorboards of the boring USA. Personally, I've always found the sound of a buzzer to be the auditory equivalent of a mosquito in a dark room. It's persistent, it's annoying, and it makes you want to swat at the air. You're standing in a cluttered laboratory in New Jersey, the air thick with the smell of acid and scorched copper, watching a man named Joseph Henry. It's a mainstream historical fact that in 1831, Henry discovered the principle of the electromagnetic telegraph, but more importantly for us, he created the first ringing bell that functioned via a remote electrical pulse. He didn't just pull a wire. He sent an invisible wave of energy over a mile of copper, proving that you could be a nuisance to someone in an entirely different building without ever leaving your chair. I've always felt that Joseph Henry is the unsung hero of the boring USA. While everyone else was obsessing over steam engines, he was figuring out how to make a piece of iron click against a bell using a battery. You see his setup, a mile of wire wrapped around the walls of a classroom, connected to a primitive electromagnet. When he touches the leads to a battery, the electromagnet wakes up and pulls a small clapper, resulting in a sharp mechanical ding. I find it relatable that Henry didn't even bother to patent it. He was a pure scientist, more interested in the how than the how much. A quirky tidbit of this era is that the very first doorbell buzzer was actually just a byproduct of Henry's attempt to create a powerful lifting magnet. Essentially, the doorbell is just a giant industrial machine that has been domesticated and taught to stop being so productive. Personally, I suspect Henry would be horrified to know that his monumental discovery is now mostly used to tell people that their pizza has arrived. You trudge over to a prototype of the terrifyingly loud vibrating buzzer, a device that replaced the single ding with a continuous rapid-fire bzzz. This was the birth of the vibrating bell, which used a clever little switch called an interrupter to keep the clapper moving as long as your finger was on the button. I find it fascinating that historians still argue whether the invention of the buzzer was a step forward or a massive psychological step backward for humanity. Personally, I think it was the moment we traded melody for urgency. A bell is a polite request. A buzzer is a demand that vibrates in your molars. Standing in the lab, hearing that first high-speed vibration, you realize that the world just got a lot louder and a lot more stressed out. I've always thought that early electromagnetism was a bit like wrestling a ghost. You can't see the magnetic field, but you can see it move a heavy iron bar, as if by magic. It's an authentic, gritty bit of 19th century wizardry that I find deeply satisfying. You see the early commercial buzzers that started appearing in high-end New York hotels, devices that allowed guests to summon a porter with a sound that I imagine was loud enough to wake the dead in the next county. Personally, I'd be the guest who is too afraid to touch the button, convinced that I was about to trigger an earthquake or at least blow a fuse in the entire block. It was a roughneck era of electrical engineering where insulation was just a bit of silk thread, or, if you were lucky, some gutta percha. You watch the iron clapper move so fast it becomes a blur, and you realize that these vibrating buzzers were the first time the doorbell became a truly mechanical heart. It didn't rely on your physical strength to pull a wire. It relied on the battery's strength to move the metal. I find it relatable that we are still chasing this, the desire for a button that does all the work for us. But back then, the work sounded like a hornet's nest trapped in a cigar box. Personally, I find the modern silent notification to be a coward's way out, compared to a device that physically shook the wall it was mounted on. As the lab's oil lamps flicker, casting long, wavering shadows of the electromagnetic coils against the brick walls, you realize that the boring USA was now officially wired. The great buzz was the sound of a new connectivity, a rhythmic mechanical pulse that linked the door to the heart of the home. You're part of the wired elite now. The ones who understand that a buzzer is just a way to harness the soul of the universe, to say, someone's here. You look at the battery, a series of glass jars filled with bubbling acid, and you can smell the sharp metallic tang of progress. I suspect the move from buzzers to chimes was less about technology and more about the fact that people were tired of jumping 3 feet into the air every time the mailman arrived. You settle into the hum of the 1830s, watching the interrupter spark with every vibration. The electromagnetic demand is a reminder that once you give people a button, they will never stop pushing it. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the durability of these early designs. They were built to last, built to be heard, and built to be impossible to ignore. It's a long way to the soft digital chime of a smartphone. But the vibration has begun. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic bzzing of the first buzzer lulling you into a state of industrial tension. The wire is hot, the magnet is pulling, and the boring USA is finally ready to move from the lab to the Victorian parlor. You take a final breath of the acid-scented air, feeling the hum in your fingertips, and you wait. The pulse is steady, the buzzer is loud, and the journey into the button is just gaining speed. You leave the vibrating, mechanical chaos of Joseph Henry's laboratory and step into the refined, albeit stifling, atmosphere of a late Victorian parlor. This is the era of the Victorian etiquette and the button revolution, where the boring USA decided that a gentle press was far superior to a violent tug. Personally, I've always found Victorian social rules to be a bit like a game of Minesweeper. One wrong move, like using the wrong spoon or ringing a bell too aggressively, and your social standing blows up in your face. You're standing on a stoop in a brownstone, looking at a small, ornate porcelain button set into a brass plate. It's a mainstream historical fact that by the 1880s, the electric push button had begun to replace the mechanical bell pull in modern urban homes, fundamentally changing the physics of the greeting. You no longer need to use your shoulder muscles to announce your arrival. You just need a single, polite index finger. I've always felt that the transition to the button was the first step toward the lazy, modern world we inhabit today. You see the button, it's cool to the touch, often made of French pearl or ivory, and it offers a satisfying tactile click. I find it relatable that this was the original killer app for the home. People were fascinated by the idea that a tiny movement could trigger a sound 3 floors away. A quirky tidbit of this era is that when the electric doorbell first arrived, many visitors were actually afraid to touch the button, fearing they would receive a lethal electric fluid shock or that the house might catch fire. Personally, I suspect those people were the ones who eventually became the grandparents who refused to use a QR code at a restaurant. There's an authentic, lingering distrust of the invisible force that I find deeply human. You trudge inside the house, following the silk-wrapped wires as they disappear behind heavy velvet curtains and ornate wallpaper. The button revolution wasn't just about the hardware, it was about the science of gentle chimes becoming a social necessity. Historians still argue whether the invention of the electric doorbell actually increased the number of uninvited visitors, as the barrier to entry, the physical effort of knocking or pulling, had been lowered to a mere tap. Personally, I think the button was the death of privacy. Once it became easy to ring, everyone started doing it. Standing in the foyer, you realized that the doorbell had become a gatekeeper for a society obsessed with status. If your button was polished and your chime was melodious, you were a person of taste. If your buzzer sounded like a dying hornet, you were clearly failing at life. I've always thought that Victorian wiring was a sensory nightmare hidden behind beauty. You look at the interconnect system, miles of thin copper wire insulated with nothing but thread and wax. It's a roughneck setup that would make a modern fire marshal weep. I find it relatable that we still do this, hiding the messy reality of our technology behind a sleek, aesthetic interface. Back then, your gentle chime was powered by a Leclanché cell in the basement, a glass jar of chemicals that required constant maintenance. Personally, I'd be the one forgetting to add the ammonium chloride, resulting in a silent doorbell and a very confused milkman standing on the porch. You watch a visitor press the button. There's no scraping of wires, no groaning of pulleys, just a soft, distant ding that feels like it's floating in the air. This was the button revolution in action, the disconnection of the user from the machine. I find it relatable that we are still chasing this magic feeling. When you tap a screen today, you expect the world to move. and the Victorian doorbell was the first time that became a domestic reality. Personally, I find the mechanical silence of the button to be a bit eerie compared to the honest friction of the old bell pull. It's as if the house is now haunted by electricity rather than operated by people. As the gaslight hums overhead, casting long, wavering shadows of the button plate against the stonework, you realize that the boring USA was now officially addicted to the push. The doorbell had become the ultimate symbol of the modern American home, efficient, polite, and slightly detached. You're part of the button-pushing elite now, the ones who understand that power comes from the smallest movements. You look at the brass plate, and you can see your own reflection in the polish. I suspect the move toward more complex chimes was a way to make the invisible sound feel more substantial, more worthy of the effort of a single click. You settle into the stillness of the Victorian hallway, watching the dust motes dance in a shaft of light. The etiquette of the ring is a reminder that even when we automate things, we still find ways to make them complicated with rules. Personally, I find a lot of humor in the idea of a proper way to press a button. Not too long, not too short, just enough to be heard but not enough to be rude. It's a long way to the haptic buzz of a doorbell on your smartwatch, but the revolution has been won. You close your eyes for a second. The distant, polite ding of the electric bell lulling you into a state of social grace. The circuit is closed, the bell is ringing, and the boring USA is finally moving from the parlor to the basement to check the batteries. You take a final breath of the lavender and soot-scented air, feeling the click of the button in your soul, and you wait. The guest is here, the etiquette is observed, and the journey into the acid jar is just downstairs. You descend the narrow, creaking stairs into the heart of the Victorian subterranean world, leaving the polished brass of the parlor behind for the batteries, acid, and leaky basements that kept the boring USA humming. Personally, I've always found basements to be deeply honest places. They are the architectural equivalent of the junk drawer in your kitchen, full of things that are essential but nobody wants to look at. You're standing in a damp, limestone-walled cellar, and the air is thick with the sharp, metallic tang of chemical reactions and the earthy scent of cold stone. It's a mainstream historical fact that before the widespread adoption of the doorbell transformer in the early 20th century, every electric bell system relied on wet cells, most commonly the Leclanché cell. These weren't the sleek, leak-proof AA batteries you're used to. They were open-glass jars filled with a liquid electrolyte, looking more like a middle school science project than a reliable power source. I've always felt that the wet cell was a bit too temperamental for something as basic as a doorbell. You see the setup sitting on a high shelf to keep it away from curious children or wandering cats. A glass jar filled with a solution of ammonium chloride, a central carbon rod, and a zinc rod dipping into the liquid. I find it relatable that these were the original high-maintenance gadgets. If the water evaporated, the bell stopped. If the zinc rod corroded too much, the bell stopped. If the jar cracked during a particularly cold winter, you had a leaky basement and a silent front door. A quirky tidbit of this chemical era is that many homeowners would actually add a layer of oil to the top of the liquid to prevent evaporation, resulting in a battery that looked like a very dangerous salad dressing. Personally, I suspect that the boring USA was largely fueled by a constant low-level anxiety about whether or not the doorbell jars were topped off. You trudge over to a particularly crusty-looking jar, its rim white with crystallized salts, the creeping salts of the 19th century. This was the science of survival for the early electrical home. Historians still argue whether the complexity of these early batteries actually hindered the adoption of the electric doorbell in rural areas where battery maintenance was just one more chore on an already long list. Personally, I think it turned every homeowner into an amateur chemist. You weren't just a consumer, you were a caretaker of the spark. Standing in the dim light of a single tallow candle, watching the tiny bubbles of hydrogen gas cling to the zinc rod, you realize that your gentle chime upstairs was actually a byproduct of a slow-motion chemical war happening in your basement. I've always thought that early domestic power was a very roughneck affair. There was no plug and play. If your doorbell died, you didn't call an electrician. You got out a jug of ammonium chloride and a scrub brush. It's an authentic, gritty bit of history that makes our modern rechargeable world look a bit pampered. You see the early dry cells that began to replace these wet jars in the 1890s, the ancestors of the modern battery, but even they were prone to swelling and leaking a corrosive paste that could eat through a wooden shelf in a month. Personally, I'd be the one triple-checking the shelf every morning, terrified that my modern convenience was about to melt its way through the floorboards. You watch a drop of condensation slide down the cold glass of the jar, and you realize that these acid jars were the first time the American home became a self-contained power plant. I find it relatable that we are coming back to this, with solar batteries and home power walls, but back then, your grid was just a shelf in the cellar. Personally, I find the raw, bubbling honesty of the wet cell to be much more fascinating than a sealed lithium pack. You could see the energy being used. You could smell the progress. It was a rhythmic, chemical pulse that connected the damp earth of the basement to the polite click of the button on the porch. As the candle flickers, casting long, wavering shadows of the jars against the damp masonry, you realize that the boring USA was built on these hidden, messy foundations. The doorbell wasn't just a luxury. It was the first time we invited the invisible fluid of electricity to live with us permanently. You're part of the chemical elite now, the ones who understand that beauty requires a bit of acid in the basement. I suspect the move toward the transformer was a massive relief for everyone who was tired of smelling ammonium chloride every time they went down to get a jar of pickles. You settle into the cool, quiet dampness of the basement, watching the zinc rod slowly dissolve in its bath. The leaky basement is a reminder that technology always has a price, and in 1890, that price was paid in glass and salt. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the patience required to live in that world. It's a long way to the maintenance-free, solid-state electronics of today, but the chemistry has begun. You close your eyes for a second, the slow, rhythmic plip of a leak lulling you into a state of chemical readiness. The air is sharp, the jars are full, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move from the basement back upstairs to find a melody. You take a final breath of the metallic, earthy air, feeling the hum of the latent charge in the stone, and you wait. The guest is pressing the button, the circuit is closing, and the journey into the chime is just starting to sing. You emerge from the damp, chemical gloom of the basement and follow the copper veins of the house back up to the hallway, where the science of the perfect ding-dong begins to transform raw electricity into domestic music. Personally, I've always found it a bit strange how we've collectively decided that a two-note falling fourth is the official soundtrack of Someone Is Here. It's a very specific, almost hypnotic interval that signals both a beginning and a demand. You're standing in a 1920s foyer, looking at a rectangular wooden box mounted high on the wall, its front carved with a polite neoclassical grille. It's a mainstream historical fact that the resonant chime began to replace the harsh, vibrating buzzer in the early 20th century, as homeowners demanded a sound that didn't make them spill their tea every time the postman arrived. We moved from the urgency of the buzzer to the psychology of the chime. I've always felt that the ding-dong is the original auditory comfort food. You see the mechanism inside the box, two tuned metal bars, usually made of a steel-nickel alloy, and a small solenoid with a sliding plunger. When the visitor presses the button, the plunger strikes the first bar, ding, and when they release the button, a spring pulls the plunger back to strike the second bar, dong. I find it relatable that this was the first time we applied user experience to a household alert. It wasn't just about volume, it was about the homey effect. A quirky tidbit of this musical evolution is that early chime manufacturers actually consulted with psychologists to find a frequency that was loud enough to be heard over a vacuum cleaner, but gentle enough not to trigger a startle response in a sleeping infant. Personally, I suspect they just wanted a sound that made people feel like they lived in a cathedral rather than a walk-up apartment. You trudge closer to the chime box, and you can hear the faint electrical hum of the transformer. That 16-volt life we'll explore later, waiting for its moment. This was the birth of the musical engineering of the home. Historians still argue whether the standardized ding-dong interval was chosen because it's the most recognizable or simply because it was the cheapest to manufacture using two bars of slightly different lengths. Personally, I think it's because it mimics the natural cadence of a human hello. Standing in the hallway, watching the dust motes swirl in the amber light of a stained glass transom, you realize that the doorbell had finally found its soul. It was no longer a mechanical demand, it was a rhythmic greeting. I've always thought that the two-note chime was a very roughneck piece of musical theory. It doesn't need an orchestra, it just needs a plunger and a piece of steel. It's an authentic, gritty bit of acoustic physics that I find deeply satisfying. You see the early high-end models that used resonator chambers, hollow tubes or boxes that allowed the sound to linger, creating a soft focused depth to the chime. I find it relatable that we still pay a premium for resonance today, whether it's in a car door's thud or the haptic click of a luxury watch. Personally, I'd be the one tinkering with the bars, trying to tune my doorbell to play the opening notes of a jazz standard, only to end up with a sound that makes the neighbors think the house is haunted. You watch the plunger strike the bar. It's a clean, decisive movement. There is no vibrating buzz, just a pure, percussive strike. I find it relatable that this change in sound changed the way we felt about our homes. The perfect ding-dong turned the front door from a source of anxiety into a source of connection. Personally, I find the mechanical honesty of the strike to be much more calming than the digital recorded pips of a modern smart bell. You can feel the vibration in the wall. You can hear the metal cooling down. It was a rhythmic electrical pulse that finally gave the boring USA a voice that was worth listening to. As the afternoon sun begins to fade, casting long, spindly shadows of the chime grill against the wallpaper, you realize that the doorbell had become the symphonic gatekeeper of the middle class. You're part of the resonant elite now, the ones who understand that the best sounds are the ones that fade slowly. I suspect the move from two bars to long, tubular bells was just a natural progression of this domestic ego. The desire to make your hallway sound like Big Ben. You look at the chime box, and you can almost feel the psychological homey effect washing over you. A bit of 1920s marketing magic that still works 100 years later. You settle into the quiet of the foyer, listening to the ghostly echo of a chime that rang decades ago. The science of the ding-dong is a reminder that even our most functional tools are better when they have a bit of melody. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the engineers who spent their days hitting metal bars with hammers to find the perfect note for a stranger's porch. It's a long way to the synthesized MP3 doorbells of the 90s, but the music has found its rhythm. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic ding-dong, lulling you into a state of domestic peace. The plunger is set, the bars are tuned, and the boring USA is finally preparing to go big with tubular bells. You take a final breath of the beeswax and old carpet-scented air, feeling the resonance in your chest, and you wait. The next guest is coming, the melody is ready, and the journey into the cathedral chime is just a hallway away. You leave the modest two-note chime box behind and move into the grand wood-paneled entrance halls of the 1930s, where tubular bells and cathedral aspirations began to turn middle-class hallways into miniature belfries. Personally, I've always found it a bit hilarious how much we love to scale up the mundane. It's like putting a spoiler on a minivan. You're still just going to the grocery store, but you want to look like you're ready for the Indy 500. You're standing in a foyer with high ceilings and heavy velvet drapes, looking at 3 or 4 long, gleaming brass tubes hanging from a decorative walnut housing. These aren't just doorbells, they are the cathedral aspirations of a generation that wanted their suburban home to feel like an ancestral estate. It's a mainstream historical fact that during the Great Depression and leading into the 1940s, high-end tubular door chimes became the ultimate status symbol for the American interior, promising a symphonic greeting that could be heard from every corner of the house. I've always felt that the tubular bell was the theatrical phase of the doorbell's life. You see the mechanism. Instead of a tiny plunger hitting a flat bar, you have a heavy electromagnetic striker that hits a hollow brass tube, sometimes up to 4 feet long. The result isn't a ding, it's a resonant, shimmering bong that vibrates in the air for what feels like an eternity. I find it relatable that people were obsessed with this church-like quality. If you lived in a modest bungalow in Ohio, but your doorbell sounded like the Westminster Quarters, you could pretend, for at least 10 seconds, that you were the earl of some forgotten manor. A quirky tidbit of this era is that some of these chime sets were so heavy and vibrated so intensely that they actually had to be mounted to the house's structural studs rather than just the lath and plaster. Otherwise, a particularly enthusiastic visitor could literally bring the wall down. Personally, I suspect that half the reason these went out of style was the sheer terror they induced in house guests who weren't prepared for a cathedral-grade sonic boom. You trudge over to the long bell setup, and you can see the intricate dampening system, small felt pads that prevent the tubes from clanging together like a set of unruly wind chimes. This was the peak of domestic resonant engineering. Historians still argue whether the popularity of these giant tubes was a psychological response to the uncertainty of the 1930s, a way to project stability and grandeur when the economy was falling apart. Personally, I think it was just about being louder than the neighbor's radio. Standing in the foyer, watching the golden amber light of an oil lamp reflect off the polished brass, you realize that the doorbell had become a piece of furniture. It wasn't hidden behind a neoclassic grille anymore. It was the centerpiece of the room. I've always thought that the tubular chime was a very roughneck way to do music. It's heavy, it's loud, and it requires a massive amount of brass. It's an authentic, gritty bit of acoustic luxury that I find deeply satisfying. You see the 8-note models that could play an entire melody, usually a simplified version of a religious hymn or a patriotic tune. I find it relatable that we still do this with our ringtones, personalizing our alerts to show off our taste. Personally, I'd be the one accidentally wiring the tubes to play at 3 a.m. every time the house settled, resulting in a terrifying midnight symphony that would have me convinced the end of the world was at my doorstep. You watch the striker hit the longest tube. The sound is deep, rich, and incredibly authoritative. It's a symphonic status symbol that commands the house to stop and listen. I find it relatable that even in a world of digital perfection, we still crave this physical resonance. When you hear a tubular bell, you don't just hear a sound, you feel the air move. Personally, I find the digital chime of a smartphone to be a weak, tinny substitute for a device that uses gravity and brass to announce a guest. It was a rhythmic, mechanical pulse that turned the boring USA hallway into a place of ceremony. As the evening shadows lengthen, casting long, spindly silhouettes of the brass tubes against the patterned wallpaper, you realize that the doorbell had officially entered its grand architecture phase. You're part of the tubular elite now, the ones who understand that bigger is almost always better when it comes to resonance. I suspect the move from brass tubes back to compact boxes was purely a space-saving measure for the post-war housing boom, where cathedral ceilings were replaced by functional kitchens. You look at the tubes, and you can almost feel the symphonic ambition of the 1930s. A bit of domestic theater that turned every visitor into a momentous event. You settle into the stillness of the grand hallway, listening to the long fading tale of the last chime. The resonance of the 30s is a reminder that we've always wanted our homes to feel more significant than they actually are. Personally, I find a lot of humor in the idea of a doorbell that takes up more wall space than a coat rack. It's a long way to the plastic ding-dong of the 1970s, but the symphonic era has reached its peak. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic vibration of the brass tubes lulling you into a state of grand, domestic peace. The strikers are cocked, the tubes are polished, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move into the marketing machine of the suburbs. You take a final breath of the cedar and wool scented air, feeling the hum of the brass in your marrow, and you wait. The guest is pulling the handle, the solenoid is firing, and the journey into the new tone harmony is just a suburban block away. You leave the grand, brass-heavy echoes of the 1930s cathedral-style hallway and step into the sun-drenched, optimistic foyer of a 1950s ranch house, where new tone and the marketing of harmony turned the doorbell into a quintessential suburban status symbol. Personally, I've always found the 1950s to be a bit like a heavily retouched photograph. It looks perfect on the surface, but if you look closely at the edges, you can see the grain of a very intense desire for normalcy and niceness. You're standing on a linoleum floor, looking at a new-tone chime box that is a masterpiece of mid-century industrial design. Sleek, ivory plastic with a subtle gold leaf accent. It's a mainstream historical fact that after World War II, the company Newtone dominated the American market, successfully rebranding the doorbell from a piece of hardware into a musical instrument for the home. They didn't just sell you a ringer, they sold you the sound of the American dream. I've always felt that the 1950s doorbell was the peak of marketing harmony. You see the Newtone catalog on the coffee table? It promises that their chimes will banish the jar of the buzzer and replace it with a cheery, melodic welcome. I find it relatable that even then, we were being sold solutions to problems we didn't know we had. Was the buzzer really that traumatic? Or did we just want something that matched our new pastel-colored appliances? A quirky tidbit of this era is that Newtone actually hired professional composers to create brand-identifiable chime sequences, ensuring that a Newtone home sounded different from a generic off-brand home. Personally, I suspect this was the origin of the corporate soundscape. The same logic that eventually gave us the Intel jingle or the Netflix ta-dum. Imagine being a suburban dad in 1954, obsessing over whether your doorbell sounded too aggressive for the neighborhood barbecue. It's a bit of roughneck insecurity hidden behind a white picket fence. You trudge over to the chime box and pop the cover off. Inside, the engineering has become more compact and efficient. The symphonic status symbol of the 30s has been miniaturized into a neat package of solenoids and resonators. Historians still argue whether the post-war obsession with pleasant door chimes was a collective psychological attempt to drown out the echoes of the war. A literal domesticating of the industrial noise of the previous decade. Personally, I think it was just about the boring USA finally having enough money to care about things as trivial as the decay rate of a brass bar. Standing in the foyer, watching the dust motes dance in the light of a picture window, you realize that the doorbell had become the ultimate suburban gatekeeper. It wasn't just about who was at the door. It was about how the door sounded to the world. I've always thought that Newtone was a very roughneck marketing machine. They took a simple electromagnetic pulse and turned it into a lifestyle. It's an authentic, gritty bit of 20th century consumerism that I find deeply fascinating. You see the high-end models that included built-in clocks or intercom systems, the master stations that allowed a housewife to broadcast her voice to the backyard. I find it relatable that we are still chasing this total control today with our smart home apps. Personally, I'd be the one accidentally leaving the monitor button on, broadcasting my private grumbling about the price of milk to the entire neighborhood. You watch the plunger strike the bar. The sound is bright, crisp, and perfectly consistent. This was the science of suburban harmony, a sound that promised everything was okay, even if the world outside was changing at a terrifying pace. I find it relatable that we still crave this predictable peace. When you hear that Newtone ding-dong, you know exactly what to expect. Personally, I find the mechanical perfection of these 50s units to be a bit sterile compared to the temperamental ghost bells of the Victorian era. It was a rhythmic, electrical pulse that finally made the boring USA sound like a well-rehearsed choir. As the late afternoon sun begins to cast long horizontal shadows of the Venetian blinds against the foyer wall, you realize that the doorbell had officially entered its lifestyle branding phase. You're part of the harmonious elite now, the ones who understand that even your alerts should be fashionable. I suspect the move from ivory plastic to faux wood grain in the 60s was just a desperate attempt to keep the marketing magic alive as the suburban dream started to show its age. You look at the chime box, and you can almost feel the suburban aspiration of the 1950s. A bit of domestic theater that turned every ring into a commercial for a better life. You settle into the quiet of the ranch house foyer, listening to the clean, fading note of the chime. The harmony of the 50s is a reminder that we've always wanted our tools to reflect our ideals, even if it's just a piece of metal hitting a bar. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the designers who tried to make the boring USA sound beautiful. It's a long way to the digital, custom ringtone era of the 2000s, but the melody has become a brand. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic ding-dong of the Newtone lulling you into a state of suburban peace. The solenoids are greased, the ivory is polished, and the boring USA is finally preparing to get weird with post-war synthesizers. You take a final breath of the floor wax and tide-scented air, feeling the harmony in your soul, and you wait. The guest is here, the Newtone is ringing, and the journey into the electronic melody is just a decade away. You leave the bright, ivory plastic optimism of the Newtone era and step into a wood-paneled living room in the late 1960s, where post-war melodies and electric organs began to make the doorbell a lot more complicated and a lot more musical than it probably needed to be. Personally, I've always felt that the late 60s and early 70s were the identity crisis years for American home decor. We couldn't decide if we wanted to live in a futuristic space station or a colonial tavern, so we just mashed it all together and covered it in shag carpet. You're standing in a foyer that smells of wood polish and fondue, looking at a massive avocado green wall unit that looks less like a doorbell and more like a dashboard for a small aircraft. It's a mainstream historical fact that by this era, the simple ding-dong was being challenged by long-play door chimes that utilized miniature electric organ technology to play full melodies. We moved from the science of the strike to the theater of the circuit. I've always felt that a doorbell playing Home on the Range is a bit of a social hostage situation. You're standing on the porch, you press the button, and now you're legally obligated to stand there for 12 seconds of synthesized Americana before anyone answers the door. You see the interior of this beast. It's no longer just a plunger and a bar. It's a motorized cam system or a primitive integrated circuit that triggers a series of synthesized tones. I find it relatable that this was the peak of gadget culture. If you could afford a doorbell that played the Yellow Rose of Texas, you were clearly the tech-forward king of the cul-de-sac. A quirky tidbit of this era is that some of these melodic units were so complex they had seasonal settings. You could switch from "Oh Susanna" in the summer to "Jingle Bells" in December with the flick of a switch. Personally, I suspect these were the primary cause of neighborly disputes in the 70s. There's only so many times you can hear a tinny, electric version of Dixie before you start looking for wire cutters. You trudge over to the control panel, and you can see the electric organ influence, small capacitors and resistors that hum with a low-frequency vibration. This was the birth of the synthesized greeting. Historians still argue whether this move toward complex melodies was a way for the boring USA to express individuality in an increasingly cookie-cutter suburban landscape, or if it was just a result of electronic components becoming cheap enough to play with. Personally, I think it was a distraction from the fact that the actual houses were getting smaller and the walls thinner. Standing in the foyer, watching the long, wavering shadows of a lava lamp against the faux wood paneling, you realize that the doorbell had become a performance. It wasn't about the visitor anymore, it was about the homeowner's playlist. I've always thought that the melodic doorbell was a very roughneck attempt at sophistication. It's the home improvement equivalent of wearing a tuxedo t-shirt. It's an authentic, gritty bit of post-war excess that I find deeply funny. You see the early solid-state models that promised no moving parts, yet they often sounded like a robot having a nervous breakdown in a wind tunnel. I find it relatable that we still love this customization, from our custom ringtones to our personalized emojis. Personally, I'd be the one who wires my doorbell to play a dramatic pipe organ chord every time the mailman arrives, just to keep the neighborhood on its toes. You watch the homeowner demonstrate the melody selection dial. It's a rhythmic, mechanical click as they cycle through the options. This was the science of choice, the idea that even our interruptions should reflect our personality. I find it relatable that we are still obsessed with this curated life. When you hear a doorbell play a full song today, it usually feels like a kitschy relic, but in 1972, it felt like the future. Personally, I find the sheer ambition of these electric organ doorbells to be a bit endearing compared to the silent, vibrating alerts of a modern smartphone. It was a rhythmic, electrical pulse that finally allowed the boring USA to sing its own praise, even if it was a bit off-key. As the evening light filters through the textured amber glass of the front door, casting long, distorted shadows of the master station against the shag rug, you realize that the doorbell had officially entered its gimmick phase. You're part of the melodic elite now, the ones who understand that a greeting is better when it has a chorus. I suspect the move from these complex organ bells back to simple pips in the 80s was a collective realization that maybe, just maybe, we don't need a symphony to tell us the neighbor is here to borrow a cup of sugar. You look at the green plastic housing, and you can almost feel the technological hubris of the 1970s, a bit of domestic theater that turned every ring into a mini-concert. You settle into the stillness of the wood-paneled room, listening to the ghostly, electronic tale of a home-on-the-range rendition that finished 3 decades ago. The melody of the 70s is a reminder that even our most functional tools can be a canvas for our weirdness. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the designers who tried to turn a 16-volt spark into a folk song. It's a long way to the high-definition audio of a modern video doorbell, but the music has become digital. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic, tinny notes of the electric organ lulling you into a state of kitschy peace. The circuits are warm, the cam is turning, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move into the attic to find the transformer. You take a final breath of the lemon wax and stale popcorn-scented air, feeling the melody in your heart, and you wait. The visitor is pressing the button, the melody is playing, and the journey into the hidden humming heart of the system is just upstairs. You leave the kitschy, melodic theater of the 1970s and trudge toward the attic, climbing a shaky stepladder into the dusty, cramped rafters of the house to find the transformer and the 16-volt life. Personally, I've always found attics to be the confessionals of architecture. They hold the truth about how a house actually works, stripped of the wallpaper and the pretense. You're crouching under a sloped roof, the air thick with the smell of old insulation and dry rotted wood, illuminated only by the weak yellow beam of a flashlight. There, mounted to a wooden joist or a junction box, is a small, heavy metal cube, the transformer. It's a mainstream historical fact that the doorbell transformer, which stepped down the standard 120-volt house current to a safe, manageable 16 volts, was the innovation that finally killed the wet cell battery and allowed the doorbell to become a permanent, maintenance-free resident of the American home. I've always felt that the transformer is the unsung heavy lifter of the boring USA. It is the hidden, humming heart that breathes life into the system, yet nobody ever thinks about it until the doorbell stops working. You reach out and touch the metal casing. It's warm, a constant, low-level fever of electrical resistance. I find it relatable that this device is basically the forgotten ancestor of your laptop charger or your phone block. It's a rhythmic, electromagnetic pulse that has been humming in the background of your life for decades. A quirky tidbit of this electrical evolution is that these transformers are designed to be always on, meaning that for the last 50 years, this little box has been slowly sipping electricity and turning it into heat, just so you don't miss a package. Personally, I suspect that if we added up all the wasted heat from doorbell transformers across the country, we could probably power a small city, or at least toast a very large bagel. You watch the 2 thin copper wires, the low-voltage leads, as they disappear into the dark corners of the attic, heading toward the button and the chime. This was the birth of the wired certainty of the home. Historians still argue whether the standardization of 16 volts was a result of safety regulations or simply because that was the minimum voltage required to consistently fire a solenoid over long runs of thin wire. Personally, I think it was a compromise between enough power to work and not enough power to kill the mailman. Standing in the attic, surrounded by the ghosts of discarded Christmas decorations and old suitcases, you realize that the doorbell had finally become part of the house's skeletal structure. It wasn't a gadget anymore. It was an organ. I've always thought that the doorbell transformer was a very roughneck piece of technology. It has no moving parts, no software to update, and it can last for 80 years without anyone saying thank you. It's an authentic, gritty bit of industrial survival that I find deeply moving. You see the early porcelain-mounted models that look like they belong in a power substation rather than a residential attic. I find it relatable that we are still reliant on these old-school magnetic induction principles even in the age of the cloud. Personally, I'd be the one staring at the transformer, wondering if that faint 60-cycle hum is a sign of reliable service, or a warning that my house is about to become a pile of ash. You listen to the 16-volt life, that steady rhythmic vibration that is the baseline of the boring USA. It's a sound that you don't hear with your ears so much as your bones. I find it relatable that we all have these hidden hums in our lives. The refrigerator, the HVAC, the distant traffic, that we only notice when they stop. Personally, I find the reliability of the transformer to be a bit of a miracle. It's a silent, electromagnetic sentinel that never sleeps. It was a rhythmic, electrical pulse that finally connected the boring USA to the grid in a way that was both invisible and essential. As the flashlight beam catches a spider web vibrating in the draft, you realize that the doorbell had officially entered its structural reliability phase. You're part of the low-voltage elite now, the ones who understand that real power is often found in the attic, hidden under a pile of old blankets. I suspect the move from these heavy, humming cubes to the switching power supplies of modern electronics was a loss of soul, even if it saved a few cents on the electric bill. You look at the transformer, and you can almost feel the electrical persistence of the mid-20th century, a bit of domestic engineering that turned a spark into a permanent resident. You settle into a crouch on the attic floor, listening to the hum of the house. The silence of the attic is a reminder that the most important parts of our lives are often the ones we ignore. Personally, I find a lot of respect in a machine that is built to be forgotten. It's a long way to the battery-powered wireless sticks of today, but the foundation is magnetic. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic hum of the transformer lulling you into a state of industrial peace. The coils are tight, the voltage is steady, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move back down to the hallway to see the plastic revolution. You take a final breath of the dusty, dry wood-scented air, feeling the vibration in your skull, and you wait. The circuit is open, the transformer is humming, and the journey into the beige plastic minimalism of the 60s is just a ladder crawl away. You descend from the dusty, magnetic hum of the attic and return to the hallway of a 1960s suburban tract home, where the plastic housings and the mid-century aesthetic began to flatten the doorbell into a beige, functional afterthought. Personally, I've always found the mid-60s to be the era where design started to get a bit tired. It's like the world spent so much energy on the space race and tail fins that it just gave up when it got to the hallway hardware. You're standing on a shag carpet that feels like walking on a very groomed sheep, looking at a chime box that has traded the mahogany and brass of the past for a slab of injection-molded, wood-grained plastic. It's a mainstream historical fact that by the mid-1960s, the doorbell industry followed the rest of the American manufacturing world into the plastic revolution, prioritizing low-cost and functional minimalism over the resonant, decorative status symbols of the previous decades. I've always felt that the 60s doorbell was the introvert of the boring USA. It didn't want to be the centerpiece. It wanted to blend into the wallpaper until it disappeared. You see the chime housing. It's a rectangle of harvest gold or desert sand plastic with a faux louvered front that looks like it belongs on the side of a budget air conditioner. I find it relatable that this was the beginning of the disposable culture. If the plastic cracked or turned that weird nicotine yellow color over time, you didn't repair it. You just bought another $5 unit at the local hardware store. A quirky tidbit of this era is that some manufacturers actually experimented with scented plastic housings that were supposed to release a faint floral aroma every time the chime rang, essentially the original home fragrance plug-in. Personally, I suspect those were a disaster, probably smelling more like burnt chemicals and cheap perfume than a rose garden, which might explain why they lasted about as long as a New Year's resolution. You trudge over to the unit and tap the plastic. It gives a hollow, uninspiring clack. This was the birth of the beige minimalism of the American interior. Historians still argue whether the transition to plastic was a response to the democratization of luxury, making doorbells affordable for every new suburban home, or if it was just a cynical race to the bottom for profit margins. Personally, I think it was a bit of both. We wanted the boring USA to be accessible, but we forgot that accessible often sounds a bit tinny. Standing in the hallway, watching the afternoon sun filter through a textured glass window, you realize that the doorbell had become a utility. It wasn't a cathedral aspiration anymore. It was just a piece of plastic that told you the neighbor was here to return your lawnmower. I've always thought that mid-century plastic was a very roughneck material in its own way. It was tough, it was cheap, and it could be molded into any shape the marketing department dreamed up. It's an authentic, gritty bit of 20th century chemistry that I find strangely comforting. You see the interior of the box. The solenoids are now smaller, the metal bars are thinner, and everything is mounted on a plastic chassis that hums with a slightly different frequency than the old wood-mounted units. I find it relatable that we still live with this good enough engineering today. Personally, I'd be the one trying to upgrade my plastic chime by gluing bits of scrap wood to it, trying to reclaim that lost resonance, only to end up with something that looks like a middle school art project gone wrong. You watch the homeowner press the plastic button outside. The sound inside is a sharp, efficient ding-dong. It's a rhythmic, mechanical pulse that has lost its soft-focus tail. The plastic doesn't hold the vibration, it swallows it. I find it relatable that we are still chasing the perfect sound in a world made of cheaper materials. When you hear a plastic doorbell today, it feels like a memory of a memory. Personally, I find the beige minimalism to be a bit of a letdown compared to the heavy, authoritative brass of the 30s. It was the sound of a boring USA that was more interested in the 40-hour workweek than the symphonic greeting. As the shadows of the ranch-style eaves stretch across the driveway, casting long, horizontal bars of shade against the hallway wall, you realize that the doorbell had officially entered its invisible utility phase. You're part of the functional elite now, the ones who understand that beauty is secondary to the circuit working every time. I suspect the move from beige plastic to the digital wireless boxes of the 80s was just a way to escape the boredom of the hallway entirely. You look at the plastic housing, and you can almost feel the pragmatic aspiration of the 1960s. A bit of domestic engineering that turned a luxury into a standard feature for every kitchen entryway. You settle into the quiet of the 60s foyer, listening to the flat, unadorned silence of a house that doesn't need to show off. The minimalism of the 60s is a reminder that sometimes the most successful tools are the ones that don't ask for our attention. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the durability of these plastic units. They are the roach of the electrical world. They'll still be ringing long after the rest of the house has been remodeled. It's a long way to the high-tech interference of the wireless era, but the plastic has set the stage. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic, flat ding-dong lulling you into a state of functional peace. The plastic is cool, the bars are tight, and the boring USA is finally preparing to cut the wires and go wireless. You take a final breath of the floor wax and stale cereal-scented air, feeling the pragmatism in your bones, and you wait. The guest is pressing the button, the solenoid is firing, and the journey into the ghostly interference of the 80s is just a radio wave away. You leave the tethered, beige certainty of the plastic-cased 1960s and drift into the early 1980s, an era where we decided that wires were far too much trouble, and that wireless interference and ghostly visitors were a fair trade for not having to drill through a header beam. Personally, I've always found early wireless technology to be the peak of human optimism. It's like trying to have a conversation through a tin can phone during a hurricane and being surprised when you hear the neighbor's grocery list instead of your own thoughts. You're standing in a split-level entryway that smells of lemon furniture polish and new wall-to-wall carpeting, looking at a small battery-powered box that sticks to the wall with double-sided foam tape. It's a mainstream historical fact that the consumer-grade wireless doorbell hit the boring USA market in the late 70s and early 80s, utilizing basic radio frequency, RF signals, to trigger a chime without a single foot of copper wire being run to the attic. I've always felt that the wireless doorbell was the ghost in the machine of the suburban experience. You see the problem immediately. These early units operated on very crowded, unshielded frequencies, often the same 315 MHz or 433 MHz bands used by garage door openers, car alarms, and those clunky walkie-talkies that every kid had in 1984. I find it relatable that this led to a decade of ghostly visitors. You're sitting on the couch, watching a sitcom, and suddenly the doorbell rings with a tinny electronic trill. But when you look at the porch, there's nothing but a confused moth and the evening shadows. A quirky tidbit of this radio wave era is that some high-end wireless bells actually had frequency dip switches on the back, tiny, microscopic toggles that you had to flip in a specific sequence to stop your neighbor's doorbell from ringing yours. Personally, I suspect that half the neighborhood was just accidentally pranking each other for years, creating a symphony of unintended chimes that moved through the cul-de-sac like a viral infection. You trudge over to the receiver and pop open the battery compartment, which is inevitably filled with 4 AA batteries that have started to grow a fine white fuzz of potassium carbonate. This was the birth of the maintenance-heavy convenience of the modern home. Historians still argue whether the move to wireless was actually a step forward in domestic engineering or just a way for manufacturers to sell more batteries and avoid the roughneck labor of real wiring. Personally, I think it was the moment we traded permanence for portability. Standing in the hallway, watching the red LED on the unit flicker every time a neighbor's kid keys their radio, you realize that the doorbell had become a part of the electromagnetic soup we all live in. It wasn't a physical circuit anymore. It was a suggestion floating in the air. I've always thought that early RF technology was a very roughneck version of magic. You can't see the wave, but you can see the result, even if the result is your doorbell ringing because someone 3 houses away is opening their trunk. It's an authentic, gritty bit of 80s frustration that I find strangely nostalgic. You see the chime selection buttons that offered 5 different electronic tunes, each one sounding like a synthesized bird being electrocuted in a microwave. I find it relatable that we still pay for choice, even when every option is terrible. Personally, I'd be the one frantically flipping dip switches at 2 a.m., trying to find a clean channel so my house would stop announcing guests that don't exist. You watch the LED blink. It's a rhythmic digital pulse that has no physical connection to the button on the porch. I find it relatable that we have become so used to this delayed reality. When you push a wireless button, there's a microsecond of silence while the chips negotiate the signal. A buffering period that feels like an eternity compared to the instant ding of a solenoid. Personally, I find the wireless interference to be a bit of a psychological tax on modern life. You never quite trust it. Is the battery dead? Is the signal blocked by the refrigerator? Is the ghost of a 1980s radio hobbyist trying to tell me something? As the neon blue twilight filters through the blinds, casting long, pixelated shadows across the wallpaper, you realize that the doorbell had officially entered its invisible frustration phase. You're part of the frequency elite now, the ones who understand that the air is full of voices. I suspect the move from these early RF units to the digital encrypted signals of the 90s was just a way to regain the privacy we accidentally broadcasted to the whole street. You look at the plastic box, and you can almost feel the radio frequency anxiety of the 1980s, a bit of domestic theater that turned a simple greeting into a game of electronic hide-and-seek. You settle into the silence of the 80s living room, waiting for the next ghost ring. The interference of the 80s is a reminder that when we cut the wires, we also cut the certainty. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the people who stuck with their 16-volt transformers in the attic. They knew that a physical connection is the only one that truly lasts. It's a long way to the high-bandwidth, 5 GHz video streams of a Ring camera, but the waves have been launched. You close your eyes for a second, the phantom, tinny trill of a wireless chime lulling you into a state of electronic unease. The batteries are leaking, the signal is bouncing. And the boring USA is finally preparing to trade its analog soul for the digital pips of the microchip. You take a final breath of the hairspray and new carpet-scented air, feeling the static in your hair, and you wait. The signal is in the air, the chime is confused, and the journey into the loss of resonance is just a chipset away. You leave the spectral, radio frequency chaos of the 1980s behind and step into the sleek, sanitized entryway of the late 1990s and early 2000s, where digital pips and the loss of resonance signaled a fundamental shift in the boring USA soundscape. Personally, I've always found this era of technology to be the most soulless. It's the time when we traded the heavy, honest vibration of metal for the calculated, tinny chirps of a microchip. You're standing on a hardwood floor that feels a bit too perfect, looking at a doorbell receiver that has shrunk to the size of a pack of cards, made of a white plastic that feels light and fragile. It's a mainstream historical fact that by the turn of the millennium, the traditional electromagnetic solenoid was being rapidly replaced by the piezoelectric speaker and the pre-recorded digital file. We moved from the science of percussion to the math of the audio clip. I've always felt that a digital doorbell is a bit like a polite lie. You see the device? When the button is pressed, it doesn't strike a bar. It triggers a tiny processor to play a low-resolution MP3 or a MIDI file. I find it relatable that we were so dazzled by the choice of having 40 different melodies that we didn't notice the quality of the sound had plummeted. A quirky tidbit of this microchip era is that some of these early digital units were actually reprogrammable via a USB port, allowing you to upload your own sounds, leading to a brief dark period where people's front doors would shout, "What's up?" or play the theme from The Matrix at high volume. Personally, I suspect this was the moment the doorbell lost its dignity. Imagine being a serious person, a doctor or a lawyer, and your front door greets a client with a 12-bit rendition of a barking dog. It's a roughneck bit of technological hubris that I find deeply cringeworthy. You trudge over to the speaker grill and listen closely. This was the loss of resonance in its purest form. Historians still argue whether the move to digital pips was driven by consumer demand for variety or simply by the fact that a microchip costs a fraction of a cent compared to a tuned steel bar. Personally, I think it was the death of physicality in our homes. Standing in the foyer, watching the cold blue light of a digital clock reflect off the wall, you realize that the doorbell had become an app before apps even existed. It wasn't moving the air anymore, it was just vibrating a tiny ceramic disc. I've always thought that digital audio in the 2000s was a very roughneck version of luxury. It promised the world but delivered a tinny reality. It's an authentic, gritty bit of the digital transition that I find strangely hollow. You see the units that claim to have high-fidelity sound, yet they still sounded like a musical greeting card that had been left in the rain. I find it relatable that we still tolerate this, accepting lower quality for the sake of convenience. Personally, I'd be the one searching through the 48.8B. 8 melodic options for 5 hours, only to realize that every single one of them makes me want to move to a cave in the woods where the only doorbell is a goat. You watch the homeowner demonstrate the selection button. It's a rhythmic, digital beep as they cycle through the options. Westminster, Ding Dong, For Elise, and Bird Chirp. I find it relatable that we are still trapped in this paradox of choice. When you have 40 options, none of them feel special. Personally, I find the digital pip to be a bit of a psychological dead end. It's a sound that doesn't linger. It just happens and then vanishes into the digital ether. It was a rhythmic electrical pulse that finally turned the boring USA into a series of one-bit alerts. As the pale electronic glow of the streetlights filters through the blinds, casting long geometric shadows across the entryway, you realize that the doorbell had officially entered its disposable data phase. You're part of the Silicon elite now, the ones who understand that the world is made of code. I suspect the move from these early digital pips to the high-bandwidth video doorbells of today was just a way to add a face to a sound that had become entirely too anonymous. You look at the small plastic box, and you can almost feel the digital boredom of the year 2002, a bit of domestic engineering that turned a mechanical greeting into a calculation. You settle into the stillness of the early aughts foyer, waiting for a sound that has no weight. The silence of the chip is a reminder that when we digitize things, we often lose the soul that made them worth having in the first place. Personally, I find a lot of respect in the old solenoid units that are still humming away in the older parts of town. They are at least real. It's a long way to the facial recognition algorithms of a modern smart cam, but the math has been done. You close your eyes for a second, the rhythmic, tinny pip of a digital chime lulling you into a state of electronic numbness. The chips are cool, the memory is full, and the boring USA is finally preparing to move toward the surveillance state. You take a final breath of the new car smell air, feeling the lack of resonance in your chest, and you wait. The signal is processed, the audio is playing, and the journey into the smart cam return is just a Wi-Fi connection away. You leave the hollow digital pips of the early 2000s behind and step into the high-bandwidth, ultra-connected porch of today, where smart cams and the return of surveillance have turned the doorbell into a digital sentry that never blinks. Personally, I've always found it a bit ironic that we spent 100 years trying to make the doorbell sound welcoming, only to end up with a device that treats every visitor like a potential suspect in a police lineup. You're standing on a modern composite deck, looking at a sleek, matte black slab with a glowing blue ring and a tiny, unblinking glass eye. It's a mainstream historical fact that the smart video doorbell, popularized in the mid-2010s, fundamentally altered the boring USA social contract by replacing the polite request for entry with a high-definition broadcast of the porch. We've come full circle, moving from the physical security of a heavy oak door to the digital security of a cloud-based gatekeeper. I've always felt that the smart doorbell is the ultimate introvert's shield. You see the interface on your phone. You can see who's there, talk to them through a tiny distorted speaker, and pretend you're in a different country when you're actually just in the kitchen eating cereal in your pajamas. I find it relatable that this has created a new kind of digital vertigo. We are more connected to our front doors than ever before, yet we are more afraid to actually open them. A quirky tidbit of this surveillance era is that researchers have noted a significant behavioral shift in delivery drivers and neighbors. People now perform for the camera, adjusting their hair, checking their teeth, or even dancing for a viral moment, because they know the doorbell is always watching. Personally, I suspect that the boring USA has become a giant suburban reality show where the doorbell is the executive producer. Imagine the Victorian visitor with their pearl button being told that one day their greeting would be stored on a server in Virginia for all eternity. It's a roughneck level of data mining that I find deeply unsettling. You trudge over to the lens and look into the glass. This is the return of surveillance in its most domestic form. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of video doorbells has actually made neighborhoods safer, or if it has simply increased our collective existential anxiety by showing us every stray cat and leaf shadow as a potential threat. Personally, I think it's turned us all into amateur security guards. Standing in the cool, blue glow of the porch light, watching the recording notification flicker, you realize that the doorbell is no longer a tool for the visitor. It's a tool for the owner. It's a rhythmic digital pulse that has turned the homey effect of the 1920s into the watchful eye of the 2020s. I've always thought that smart technology is a very roughneck version of peace of mind. It promises safety, but delivers a constant stream of motion-detected notifications. It's an authentic, gritty bit of the modern experience that I find strangely exhausting. You see the units that feature AI human detection and package protection, yet they still occasionally lose their minds over a particularly large moth. I find it relatable that we still trust these machines even when they fail, accepting the glitch as part of the price of progress. Personally, I'd be the one checking the live feed every 5 minutes, convinced that the wind was actually a secret agent, only to realize I'm just watching a neighbor's recycling bin blow down the street. You watch the blue ring pulse with light. It's a rhythmic, haptic signal that has no physical bell and no 16-volt transformer in the attic. I find it relatable that we have moved toward this invisible fortress. When someone pushes a smart button today, the sound doesn't happen in the house. It happens in your pocket. Personally, I find the return to surveillance to be a bit of a tragedy for the science of the chime. We've lost the resonance of the brass tube and the honesty of the steel bar, replacing them with a data packet and a push notification. It was a rhythmic, electrical pulse that finally connected the boring USA to a global network of watchers. As the late-night silence settles over the suburb, casting long, sharp shadows of the modern streetlights across the driveway, You realize that the doorbell has officially entered its God mode phase. You're part of the watched elite now, the ones who understand that privacy is a relic of a pre-fiber optic world. I suspect the move from these cameras to the integrated, biometric smart locks of the future is just the final rivet in the wall we've built around ourselves. You look at the matte black housing, and you can almost feel the digital vigilance of the present day, a bit of domestic engineering that turned a simple greeting into a security event. The world has become very quiet now, hasn't it? The heavy thud of the lion's head knocker has faded into a distant iron echo, and the sharp, urgent buzz of the electromagnetic wire has settled into a gentle, rhythmic hum of the cloud. You can feel the heaviness in your limbs, that deep, comfortable warmth that comes when the journey from the basement, acid jars to the silicon chips is finally over, and you are exactly where you are supposed to be. The grand tubular bells of the 1930s and the avocado green melodies of the 70s are just shadows now, drifting away into the soft focus mist of the past. You are safe, tucked away from the wind and the noise, surrounded by the quiet legacy of the engineers who tried to make a 16-volt spark sound like home. The red LED of the modern doorbell has dimmed, and the bruised purple sky of history has turned into a blanket of infinite silent stars. Each star is like a single electron in the vast circuit of the night, holding everything together while you rest. You don't need to worry about the wires, the transformers, or the motion-detected alerts anymore. They are part of the architecture now, as steady and solid as the limestone foundation. Your breathing has slowed to match the rhythmic sigh of the suburban wind, a long, slow exhale that carries away the last of the day's electrical tension. The boring USA is at peace, and you are part of that peace. Let the imagery of the vibrating brass and the glowing vacuum tubes fade into a soft, golden amber glow. There is no more maintenance to be done, no more acid to top off, and no more buttons to push. There is only the hum of the fan, the softness of the pillow, and the long, slow drift into a dreamless sleep. The signals are quiet. The gang is at rest. Everything is exactly as it should be. Close your eyes now. The circuit is open, and the world is finally still.